Hi there, Lily here with a tutorial as part of my video series on the Livingstone Vest, my latest pattern release. So in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to attach the D-rings and the belt loop. So one of the options is to have D-rings on one side with a belt that closes it as so. So we'll be placing these here. And the other option is to make two of these ties and attach one to each side so that they will knot in the centre. So I'll show you the option that I'm going to work today. So I've made this waist tie here just in 1x1 rib as whatever length you wish. Knitted quite dense so it's not too stretchy, it's quite firm, totally reversible, so there isn't a right and a wrong side of this. However, there is a right and a wrong side to the main pattern. This is the back. However, with this pattern there are two side pieces which loop round and fasten at the waist at the front here. So just make sure when you get to this stage that you have the right side facing, where the increases look like this. You can see a definite row of V's of increases, whereas on the other side it's not. Let me just move that so you can see it's not quite as defined on the other side, but it is still neat. Brioche is reversible. So I'm going to start by threading my darning needle with the end of yarn that is left over from my cast on. So I cast on this little strap separately. I'm just going to thread my needle with this end of yarn. Okay, so we're ready to start there. So with the right side of this facing up, the front of the item is just out of the way because we don't need to consider that for now. The right side facing up, I'm going to lie this strap on top of it here. I'm lying it on the left hand side, but that's just personal preference of the way that I like my belt to fasten, but it doesn't matter. So I'm going to lie that there with right sides together, though this doesn't technically have a right side, so either side, with these edges right lining up neatly here. Hopefully you can see there. It's a bit difficult to show in fluffy yarn, but hopefully you get the idea. And then I'm just going to whip stitch / over sew, however you want to, whatever term you use. Just going to over sew these two layers together right at the edges. So I do want this to be quite firm because the garment will be tied by this, but I also want it to be reasonably invisible. So just whip stitching over here. I'll go over it once and decide whether it looks like it needs going over again. We shall see. Oh, just pulling that through. So I'm just over sewing, catching the edge of one piece, the edge of the main body with the edge of the strap, and simply sewing that together using a very basic sewing stitch. Let's just see how that's looking. Yeah, that looks fine. I'll keep going right to the end because I do want this to be very secure, so making sure I do plenty stitches. This could possibly have been done by picking up stitches and making the belt in one piece, but I thought this added bit of stability from actually sewing it would be preferable. So this is what we have on the right side now. Still got this smooth line of I-cord, but we have the belt loop attached. I think I might just go back and attach it a little more snugly at the other end. So I'm going to go over that again. I'll just do a few more stitches to get me back up to the other end. I'm all for avoiding sewing where possible, but sometimes it just does the job best and you can't avoid it, so I'm not going to cut corners just to avoid a few stitches. There, I think that's complete. So there we have one finished strap attached. We now have one attached belt strap. So So if you're going for the 2-strap version, just repeat the exact same on the other side. I'm going to make the D-ring version, so I'm just going to push that out of the way. So I have two D-rings here. I can't remember the exact size in millimetres. I will look that up and post it in the description box below. So with D-rings, we want them to be slightly offset so that they'll fasten properly tightly. So I'm going to attach one to the very edge, sort of just, if you can see there, right on the edge of this piece. And I'm going to attach the other in what looks like a pearl ridge between the edgemost two brioche knit stitches. So in this sort of gutter here is where I'm going to attach the second D-ring. I'm going to try and do them with one piece of thread. So I have my yarn, just my same working yarn, made a slip knot about 4 inches from the end, so I'll be able to weave that in later. And I'm just going to bring that from the back through to the front in that first pearl gutter. Not a very pleasant sounding term, but it does the job. And then I'm just going to place this yarn through my first D-ring. So we pulled that through, and then go in, not into the exact same hole, just sort of slightly next to it. You can't be too precise about the stitches here because you do have to go into them quite a few times. And then through the loop of the slip knot on the back so that will secure. So I can pull that through, pull to tighten that slip knot, and just spin that into place there. So we have our first stitch. Now I'm just going to go along from the back, over stitching this D-ring into place here on this side. I think it's going to work better if I leave a slight gap between the stitches whilst I'm going in one direction, and then so I'm going from here to here, just working over stitches in this brioche gutter. I'm going to leave a slight gap between the stitches on this first go so that then I can go back and fill in those on a second go over and make sure it's really secure. We don't want too many stitches or it will start looking bulky. Just trying to pull that that extra tail out of the way. Sorry, this is a little fiddly to do whilst filming. I keep getting this caught. Apologies. Okay, we're good there. This is where it's handy to have a really sharp needle because sometimes you will end up splitting the yarn in order to get into the gaps. That does make for a more secure sew as well. Much as it seems painful to a knitter to split your yarn. You can see here it wants to kind of curl around, but these stitches are in a straight line, so I'm just going to kind of ease it. As long as I don't sew beyond this increase here, you can see the final increase, so that was the end of the slope. So as long as we don't sew beyond that, we're all good. Up to that point is fair game. Okay, so we have, sorry, just fidgeting a little there. We have the first D-ring attached with one row of stitches, and now I'm going to go back over it and attach, just go back the way I came up to the other side here. I've now just sewn over the same D-ring back in the opposite direction, so I've worked over stitches going from here all the way up to here, back where I started. So you can see it's now quite securely fastened on there. However many stitches you need will just depend on the thickness of your yarn, but you want this to be pretty much covered and feeling fairly secure there, so it's not going to move. And now we can begin to sew the second D-ring. Now that I've finished sewing this first D-ring, I can fold that out of the way, so we can just push it over there. It should move nice and easily, and then I'm going to use the same thread again, but now on the back. I'm just going to fold, I'll push it, there we go, that might be clearer. So I'm going to fold this over so we can access the back here. Might be looking a little messier now that you've sewn, but should still be fairly neat. So I'm just going to weave my thread under one stitch there, then it's a little nearer the edge. Still using the same thread, same piece of yarn even. Post it through a D-ring. And now this is a little more tricky because we want it to all be hidden on the wrong side. But you can see this is the very edge of the fabric here. And we want to sew this sort of as near to that as possible, but on the back, if that makes sense. So there isn't an obvious definite stitch to go into, but you can see I've just folded this over so I can see the wrong side, and I'm going to kind of catch here. I'll just move that so you can see my needle's gone through, stitches near the edge. So let's just pull. Oh, that's got twisted. Yeah, there we go, that's fine. Pull this through. And repeat. So I'm just going to overstitch this along this very back edge of the brioche stitch here. So we have a little piece of knitting, one brioche stitch between the two D-rings. So bring it through the D-ring again and through a stitch at the back and through the D-ring and through a stitch and alternate. So this is quite difficult to do whilst with a tripod in the way, trying to see what I'm doing as best as possible. Again, I'm going to work from one direction to the other and then go back on myself again. It's definitely helpful to weave in all your ends before you get to this stage. I mean, I didn't have very many ends with this project just because it only used 4 skeins of yarn in this particular yarn, but I think if I did have lots of ends hanging around now, they would just be making this more complicated than it needs to be. So weave in your ends and get them over and done with out of the way before you try sewing these on, is the point I'm making there. It's getting a little snugger to get the needle through now because I have so many hand stitches in place. But the more stitches, the more secure, so we'll go with it. Looking at the right side, we can see it's starting to take shape now. 2 D-rings sitting side by side, slightly offset. Okay, so I've sewn from here to here. I'm now going to sew back up to the top again, and then we'll tighten off my yarn, knot it, tie it off, and we'll be done. So I've reached the other end now. Both D-rings are attached quite securely. Can't pull those apart if I try. They can wiggle a little bit, but that's just inevitable. So now I'm going to fasten off this yarn and we'll be finished. Right, I say fasten off, I'm going to bring the yarn back round to the wrong side and just pull it through its own loops a few times because I really do want this to be super duper secure. Weave it in. Again, this is helpful to have a very sharp needle. Okay, woven in there. Snip that I have one more end to weave in, but I'll do that in a second. I want to see it take shape now. So now we have one belt, loop, string, whatever you want to call it, one set of D-rings, post those both through there, back on itself and through the other, and there we go. Belt fastened with D-rings.